Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for a fascinating look at Edith Halpert, the dealer who changed how we look at art. And Larissa Bailiff is back, and I say back because this is the third time this year that we've been able to talk her into coming to Darien Library. And she will give us insight into the fall exhibit at the Jewish Museum's exhibit that's going on right now, Edith Halpert and the Rise of American Art. Before I continue, I just want to thank you all for your donations to the Friends Annual Campaign and for your ongoing support for Darien Library. It's vital so that we can continue all of our programs, our musical events, the film series, everything. Thank you again. And if anyone is still using your cell phone, would you please, turn it off? Thank you. So, Larissa Bailiff, specialist in modern French art and social history, is back at the library, Darien Library, for the third time this year. In the spring, she gave us a heads up for the Joan Miro exhibit that was in New York City. And then just last month, we heard about Edward Manet and the Spirit of Spain. And tonight, we hear about this life and career of Edith Halpert, this extraordinary woman. A little bit about Larissa. She's a former associate educator at MoMA. She continues to offer tours and courses at the museum. She also works for Boulevard Arts, an immersive arts technology company, where she creates creative content for virtual and mixed reality platforms. So we feel privileged to have her with us, and please join me in welcoming Larissa back to Darien Library.
Great. So hello, everybody, and I thank you all for coming out on this bitter night. You are the troopers, and I hope that's a testament to Edith Halpert and how remarkable she is, and I really want to have you get to know her through me. I switched my slides while Jane was talking because as you alluded to, I am riffing off of tonight the museum currently up at the Jewish Museum. So this is just a slide of their website, and as you can see, you have plenty of time to get there, but I recommend you go early and often. Yes? Oh, sure. Let me see if I'm, okay, how's that? So, so please do go see the show. And I will, of course, be trying to entice you to do that through our discussion of this remarkable dealer. I just put up slides of the catalog there, and then a wonderful biography. So the silver and pink is the what I think is a really exceptional catalog for an exceptional show, and the Girl with the Gallery is a biography by Lindsay Pollock that came out several years ago, and there are copies on hand at the library. So my own. Dog-eared and well-worn, but if you just can't get enough of Edith Halpert, and I will try to pepper our talk today with some of the anecdotes and information that comes from that, but I think it's well worth the read. So, I always have too many images and too much information, and tonight will be no different, particularly as I want to pack in as much as possible about this dealer who changed how we look at art, how we buy art, how we contemplate it, and particularly American art, not just any art. And that is really something that differentiates Edith Gregor Halpert from other dealers. But before we dive into her mature career, I just wanted to sort of set the stage with a couple of photographs of her childhood. She was an émigré from Russia. She was born in Odessa to very well-to-do parents, had nursemaids, and everything looked bright. Unfortunately, when she was about 3 or 4, her father passed away. And her mother was not able to sort of take on his business. Things were getting very difficult in terms of the pogroms, and the writing was on the wall. And so Edith's mother took her and her very young sister Sonia, or actually Sonia was older than Edith, but took her young children to to live with relatives in New York. So they ended up in Spanish Harlem, and with very, very little money, or let's say what money they had went quickly. So we have a picture of Sonia and the very young Edith there, and then a photograph of Edith around the age of 16. She had stunning blue eyes, great legs, and used these attributes from time to time in her deals. But she was much more than that. She came speaking no English whatsoever, and went to public school, as did her older sister. Sonia was about 5 years older. And from knowing no English whatsoever, within a few years, she was a star pupil at school. And when her mother moved the two girls, one of the teachers rallied so that Edith could stay at the school because she was such a star pupil, particularly in science and math. So this is a really smart person, this is a really scrappy person, and that will stand her in good stead. More that we should know about her childhood. The mother ran various sort of stores and tried to run businesses, sort of selling snacks and penny candies and things like that. And Edith had to help her mother from early on to just sort of make ends meet. So she was in sales, and she was using her wits. And one of my favorite stories about Edith Gregor, because she's Edith Gregor at this point, and that's a sort of shortened form of her name, of a Russian name. She talks about, and I should say, a lot of what we know about her was presented in interviews towards the end of her life, because she wanted her whole story, as she was presenting it, to be recorded and for posterity with the Smithsonian. But one of her stories, and she's selective, by the way, about what she shares, and perhaps embellishes a little bit, but this story is about when she might be 12 or so years old, and she's helping sell things. And she talks about selling peanuts and how she was in merchandising at an early age. She realized that if you made a bag of peanuts, you had to put 14 peanuts in it. I know you didn't come here for peanuts, but you had to put 14 peanuts in the bag. You couldn't put one less, or you would lose customers, and they might talk to their friends, and you would lose sales. Nobody would come to your shop. If you put in one more, you're going to lose money. So, things are tight. But she realized that if you take these bags and you blow them up with air, and you spin the top, it's a way of dressing it up. It makes you feel like you're getting more. So you're going to attract more customers, and they would stack these up in the window, and it worked. She sold, triple the amount she had sold the day before, and she was always full of these ideas. But this idea of, you make it seem a little better, you make it prettier, you put it in front, that kind of thing, and that's the remarkable quality of Edith Halpert and what she's going to bring to the gallery there. So this is happening early on. She's feisty, scrappy, and she's full of great ideas, and she's really smart, and she's really good with numbers. So also, I should say, and I'll flip to the next slide in just a minute, we're already showing her at 16 here. At about the age of 14, not only is she going to high school, but she's really interested in taking art classes. For a while, she thinks she wants to be an artist, and this sort of ties in with her aesthetic sensibility. So maybe in the end, she won't be an artist, but she has a great eye. She can recognize talent, and she has a knack for decorating and arranging. So she is going to the National Academy of Design. Well, at the National Academy of Design, you had to be 16 years old, so she lied, right? So that she could do this. She could do this on top of her schoolwork. She's attending the National Academy of Design, and eventually she's also at the Art Students League, where she comes into contact with a number of artists and ideas about the contemporary scene. She's also eventually going to the Whitney Studio Club, which was a place where you could go. It was kind of the forerunner of the Whitney Museum, run by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. And you could draw after live models and discuss art and things like that, a rather sort of bohemian place, although not a gallery, not a place for display. Per se. So this is a picture from 1910, but imagine her in 1914, 15, 16, et cetera, at the Art Students League. It's also where she meets her husband, Sam Halpert, where she gets the last name that she keeps for the rest of her life. She marries him when she's 18. She is in the workforce. Only about 8% of women are working at this point in jobs outside the home. But at 18, she is working at Bloomingdale's and then Macy's. And she's rising up through the ranks. She has, again, great ideas, and she's not afraid to share them. You know, talking to the man who runs Macy's and telling him what she thinks, right? The staff calf is terrible and disgusting. There are cockroaches there. You can't treat your employees like that. Wow. And I want to say she gets away with it, but I mean, people do listen to her. But she does have a mouth on her, and that continues and is part of her spirit as well. But I talk about Macy's, more than Bloomingdale's, in fact, because it's at Macy's where she really learns, again, about merchandising, about putting the attractive stuff out front to pull people in, the puller-inners, as they're called. And she develops a great deal of skills, and eventually she parlays those skills and goes to work for a big bank and becomes a systematizer, as it's called. But she gets dictaphones for everybody, and she updates all the technology, whatever that was, in 1920. So between 1920 and 1925, she works for this bank. She is not a teller behind the scenes. She is doing analysis and helping them as a consultant, and she's paid good money. She becomes one of their, she's put on their board of directors at the age of, in her mid-20s. So this is a woman on the move. She, at the end of that run, is making $6,000 a year. I'm not quite sure what that translates to, and $10,000 in bonuses a year. So she is a woman who is learning and making herself useful. And when she walked into that bank, she didn't know all their systems and all everything, but apparently she just figured it all out on the spot. And again, that's going to carry through as a dealer, and particularly during very, very hard times. So there she is. She's already married to Sam at this point. Here is a painting by Sam Halpert. He was a figurative painter. Actually, these are both by Sam Halpert. One is a beautiful Flatiron painting of the Flatiron district, and the other is a little bit later portrait of his wife. And so we get a sort of sense of his style. He wasn't the most avant-garde, but he wasn't the most old-fashioned at that point. So he's doing the painting. He wants to be really making the money. So there's a bunch of strife. He starts having health problems. He's about twice her age, and he's got ringing in his ears, and he's not sleeping. So in fact, a therapist convinces Edith to give up her work and move with Sam to Paris, which they do for about 6 months. There they are. So Sam is painting, and Edith is meeting lots of dealers there and being exposed to artists, and it's kind of exciting. And she's in flux. She doesn't quite know what to do. She enjoyed working. She is a woman who needs that challenge. And Sam's not making enough money. So when they return to the States, she's got all these ideas in her head. And she purchases a gallery. And again, marital strife continues. Sam's health is problematic. Eventually, they will basically divorce. But Edith is trying to think about where she can put her creativity. Also, she saved, fortunately, counter to what the therapist had said, spend all your money in Paris. She saved those bonuses, and so she was able to put that into this new space. So this is a photograph of the downtown gallery at 113 West 13th Street. So this is in the Village. Lots to say about that. This is not where any other galleries were at this time. So galleries were uptown, hence the name, the downtown gallery. This was bohemian. There were a lot of speakeasies. This was, sort of the drinking part of town. And it was not where people of any repute spent a great deal of time. And that's something in some ways that Edith relished and sort of played up throughout her time there. She will stay there until 1940, and then she'll move further uptown. Still not 57th Street at that point, so she can still call her gallery the Downtown Gallery. But it is to say this is a place where the magic happens. She has a partner named B at the beginning of this, and of course Sam is there. And Edith lives in the upstairs and is figuring out how she's going to utilize this gallery. What more do we need to say about it? I want to say at this point that, and I'll continue to harp on this, that Edith Halpert was interested in contemporary American artists. She'll be interested in other things and she will sell other kinds of art. But what she really wanted to do was to support, encourage, facilitate the artists around her. Artists who were perhaps eclectic in style, as we'll see, but which she believed would be the future, that they needed to be seen, that they needed to be represented. And she had a more sort of democratic sense of art than the more sort of stuffy uptown dealers anyway. So if they were all red velvet plush and, you know, sit on couches and fancy sort of sense of, you know, selling, Edith wanted her space to look a little more domestic. She wanted it to be more casual. She wanted people to feel like they could come there and hang out. She called her gallery actually not the Downtown Gallery in 1926 when she first opened it. She called it Our Gallery, O-U-R Gallery, our gallery. This notion that it's kind of for everybody, that you shouldn't, you know, have to worry about stepping into the space and feel uncomfortable, that you could come in and look at art, and if you don't want to buy anything, that's fine too, and that there would be things that would be more reasonably priced. Always. Her intention wasn't to get sort of stellar prices for her artists. She wanted to keep them supported and alive, but she wanted people to feel that they could purchase something. It was more for the middle classes or anybody who wanted art, that everybody should have art. And so her strategies of marketing were geared towards that. The space was pretty small, so what she ended up doing was creating what she called the Daylight Gallery in 1930. So 3-4 years after she opened the Downtown Gallery, she took the space to the back and created a sort of annex gallery to show more works. And this is one of her artists, William Zurich, holding the doors to the Daylight Gallery. And in fact, she had a number of designer friends and artists sort of contribute to this. So it was really a wonderful collaborative space and embodied the spirit of the Downtown Gallery and the community of artists. So he's particularly proud there because he's sort of pointing to the door, and down below are these two grills, which are in the show, really wonderful metal work that he did, which is, again, part of this kind of zeitgeist collaboration of these different artists and architects. This is, and I won't show you installation views of many shows, but this is the inaugural exhibition at the Downtown Gallery, which is held in November 1926. So it was a group show, and I'm not going to tell you all of the different artists there. I've kind of singled out Ellie Nodelman with his Seated Woman that was on the sort of desk-like space or chest-like space. But another wonderful work, a little hard to see, is a tapestry on the wall by William Zurich's wife, Marguerite, who was one of Edith's favorite artists. But what I want you to notice is that domestic sensibility, right? It's not super stuffy, things aren't on pedestals, and in fact, Nodelman's sculpture is just resting on the chest. So what Edith Halpert is trying to do is to give us a new kind of sense of art that's integrated into one space. You can see what it would look like in your living room, tapestries next to sculptures, next to your furniture, so that it's a much more sort of comfortable atmosphere. And as we'll begin to see, and we'll talk about in a more focused way, she also was really interested in mixing in what we would now call folk art pieces. Raising their level to a notion of a kind of fine art and making it possible for you to see how you might have different types of art in your home. But again, stressing that she wants to promote American artists. So I'm just going to flash through a number of images really quickly just to give us a sense of some of those many artists that she represented. And, you know, this is just a section of the artists who were a part of her gallery at one point or another. But again, if you were a part of her stable, she was fiercely loyal to you and tried to find ways for you to make money, whether it was with her or through municipal art shows or in other ways. So this is Kuniyoshi and a Georgia O'Keeffe, just to give us an example of how disparate these works are, right? They're American, but what does American mean? And it often for Edith meant immigrants like herself, right? And in fact, Sam Halpert's family had immigrated from Eastern Europe as well. So she was always attracted to representing these different notions of what America could mean, who was invested in it, who was living in America, who had come to America. And just to put a fine point on it, and then I'll run through these more quickly, Kuniyoshi, a Japanese artist, but American, really, really interesting. You can see from the swimmer sort of quasi-surrealist work became very, very popular. And then as sort of a twist of fate, and popular through her sort of promotion with Pearl Harbor. There was a real controversy about whether or not he should be represented, whether he was truly American, et cetera. And so that's an instance where she continued to show his work, where she promoted him, where she was in defiance of those who spoke against him because of his background. And eventually the tide turned, no pun intended, with the swimmer. Georgia O'Keeffe wasn't exclusive, well, to anybody, but she wasn't exclusive to Edith Halpert, but frequently showed and was in conversation with Halpert, and Halpert placed her work in a lot of different places. And then after Stieglitz's death, George O'Keeffe's husband, she became more active in selling George O'Keeffe's work. A lot of different types of, different media, but particularly sculpture, paintings, drawings. And one of the ways in which Halpert tried to democratize art, again, and to make it less expensive, was to do things like sell prints. So she had a whole print program going for a while, so that really anybody could get their hands on art by these same artists. Maybe you couldn't buy a painting, but you could buy a print. So Robert Laurent, Arthur Dove, she sold hoppers, Jack Levine. Again, just for sort of contrast here, Max Weber in his sort of quasi-cubist collage-looking Chinese restaurant, or is it a collage? It is a collage, I should say. And Ben Shahn here, just represented by one work, but this was from a series he did about the what he called the Passion of Sacco and Vanzetti. And it was very, very controversial political work about immigrants, Italian immigrants who were accused of crimes and then executed. And so it was a big, as I said, brouhaha and controversy. And Ben Shahn was an artist who never shied away from controversy, whether he was representing hunger or other social issues or even very specific politics. And Edith Halpert did a whole show of his Sacco and Vanzetti works in the early 1930s. She was putting on shows sometimes 12 a year. So they might be a month. One show a month. So you can imagine that she's showing group shows, and she's also, giving other artists, 7 shows over the run of her gallery. And again, just for breadth here, we have a wonderful Charles DeMuth and John Marin, who was a favorite artist of hers. I should also say, and you'll see this when you go to the show or in looking at the catalog, that she collected these artists as well. So she didn't just, you might say, sort of skim the cream off the top. She wanted the best works to go to collectors, but she loved these artists and she wanted to have their work, and also she wanted to support them. So for a lot of these artists, they couldn't make it on their sales. So she would provide stipends and other forms of support. This is a wonderful painting by Margaret Zurich called Edith Halpert in her downtown gallery. This is from about 1930. And I just wrote on there so you can see. This is a wonderful sort of amalgam or coming together representation of, again, this community of artists that are part of this downtown gallery. So Edith is shown there. Not a very, shall we say, decorous pose. She's letting it loose. She cut a striking figure and knew how to wear clothes and had a very aesthetic sensibility, but she always had a cigarette in her hand. She was a hard drinker and, again, spoke her mind. And here she is talking to somebody, obviously a client she's very familiar with. He's looking at a nude picture. But what I want to draw your attention to are the 2 swivel chairs, made a little bit orangish here, but apparently they were sort of brown swivel chairs. And so you could sort of move move around, very sort of modern there, and also this three-tiered table. So we get to see some of the furnishings in the downtown gallery in this sort of exploration of what it's like working with clients. The floor itself, a little harder to see, but is intersecting patterns and that was designed by Zurich herself. So they're concrete colors. And so again, everything sort of about this speaks to creativity, these artists who are exhibited there and their kind of contributions to this place. I'm going to say at one point too, one of the things that that Edith, well, she was always inventing things. At a later point, she developed this metal mesh covering for the walls because you could put nails in it and they wouldn't tear or show after you took them off. And she even patented this material to cover the walls with. She had this thing called the exhibitor. Anybody curious about an exhibitor? So you could be on those swivel chairs, but there was a sort of almost like a lazy Susan, but it was like a wall that would sort of rotate, so a person behind it could put on a new work of art. So you could, I mean, you'd think that everybody was doing this, but a lot of these things Edith Halpert came up with. But fascinating way that, yeah, you want to see something else? Great. Her assistant, Lawrence Allen, is going to put something on it. You're sitting in the swivel chairs, and the exhibitor turns around, and it's a whole nother work. So, incredibly creative and good with the marketing. But it takes more than that, especially if you're being democratic about art and not charging very much money. So I'm going to bring in one of her patrons here. And she had a range of buyers from around the country and New York, and well-to-do and not so well-to-do. But she relied on the ones who were very well-to-do to sort of keep her in business. And one of her main clients, and I think this is a wonderful intersection for me in terms of my work at the Museum of Modern Art and its history, and the history of New York and art museums here. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, married to John D. Rockefeller Jr. This is one photograph of them. Really, she was a really important patron of the arts, and her taste was very different than her husband's. And he gave her an allowance starting with $25,000 and then upped it, because she spent it all, to about $40,000 a year during the late 1920s. And when he did that, she spent about $20,000 at Edith Halpert's gallery that same year that it was increased. She often bought small prints, those affordable things, $20 here, $50 there. She really enjoyed modern art and wanted to cultivate that taste. And of course, she was one of the three founders of the Museum of Modern Art. So a lot of her work ended up there, and this is all happening during that time. Imagine the Downtown Gallery starts in 1926. The Museum of Modern Art is founded by Abby Aldrich Rockefeller and two other women in 1929. Of course, there's a lot of other things happening in 1929, like the Depression. So we're talking about, a dicey time. But Abby Aldrich Rockefeller shows up one day, and she and Edith start talking, and they're thick as thieves. They become good friends, and Abby and Edith write constantly and discuss art. And in fact, Edith goes to Europe a great deal and buys European art for Abby. So that's part of how she sort of keeps in business. So she's a sort of art consultant. So here we have this sort of luxe living room to show us what most of the Rockefellers' sort of premises would have looked like. This is actually in their townhouse on West 54th that was torn down to make the sculpture garden. So they moved in 1937. So MoMA's only been on site there since 1939. But back to this this is kind of, I think, from that photograph, what we would expect of the Rockefellers. They have the money, they can do anything they want to, and that's a sort of taste. Well, Abby, she liked modern art. And not only did she get funding from her husband and sort of pass down her interest in art collecting to her children, but he let her have a very modern, what she called the Topside Gallery, in her home, so upstairs, and it was designed by Donald Deskey, as I said, who designed Radio City Music Hall, and Edith Halpert. They were very good friends. He helped her design the Daylight Gallery, and by the way, this gallery upstairs cost umpty times more than the Daylight Gallery. Let's just put it that way. You know, Desky knew that Abby had the money for it. But Abby loved this. She liked to have these sort of contraptions on the walls so she could just sort of slip the prints in there. She could buy things and she could curate her own space, essentially. I mean, Edith would come there and help her, but we can see that it's really, really modern, and all of the sort of interior furnishings, and that's a sculpture, by the way. It looks a little like a human figure, but it's not a real one. But this is Abby's space that she cultivated. And so, you know, she would drop by the gallery. I'm smiling for a second because Abby liked to get up really early, so she would show up really early, and Edith didn't get up really early. So, you know, Abby would show up with her driver and bang on the door, and, you know, and Edith would like throw her dress over her nightgown, leaving her nightgown there, coming out with a cigarette, and, you know, but they made a real pair. And by the way, I will tell you that they did go to a speakeasy one night. Abby asked Edith to take her to a speakeasy, and if you know, John D. Rockefeller Jr. was a teetotaler and totally against drinking. So, and they almost got caught by the cops. So we'll just let that sort of linger. But it was a really important relationship, you know, and Edith felt she could write to Abby with proposals and ideas. She didn't always get what she wanted, but it was really important, and it sustained the gallery. I want to throw out a number of artists that, you know, put them into the mix that we might take for granted. But I want to stress to you that Stewart Davis was a starving artist, that Edith put him on the map. And she did this for a number of different artists. Not everybody she supported is well known today, but this is somebody she had her eye on, and she didn't want him to starve. He was also supported by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, but his stuff was not selling in the 20s or the 30s, basically. So Edith threw a number of shows for Stuart Davis. This is one brochure in one of his egg beater series. You know that he painted only egg beaters, or an egg beater, basically propped up a still life and thought through its formal composition for a year. The critics didn't like any of the egg beaters, and they didn't sell, and you know, now it's at the Whitney. But so the first exhibition, I believe, that Edith had, people were up in arms. They were so angry about Stuart Davis's work. So controversy can come in different forms, and it doesn't have to be about the politics. It can be about the politics of art making and what people are willing to accept. But she kept him in business. She gave him a monthly stipend and kept him from starvation until his reputation could rise. He left her gallery for a while, and then he came back because he realized that it was really hard to self-represent. She got him, and she got many of her artists commissions to work on the Radio City Music Hall murals and construction. They didn't get a great deal of money for this. The person who got the most money was Georgia O'Keeffe, and she actually backed out at the last minute, stress with Stieglitz. But this Davis's Men Without Women of 1932, and you can see it installed in the men's lounge. William Zurich did sculpture, and so again, a number of different artists worked on this, and that's a good commission. So again, if Edith wasn't just selling the work, she was supporting them. She was getting commissions for them. She helped run municipal shows throughout the country, but particularly the Eastern Seaboard. She worked a lot with government in Washington, D.C. to support these artists, to get exhibitions for them. So again, it's not just about selling. It's about getting her artists promoted. And by her, I mean she wants the American art of its time to be seen. You know, remember, modern art at this point is European art. The Museum of Modern Art is mostly devoted at this time to European art. I can't stress that enough. It's, you know, Picasso and Miro and Matisse, and, you know, or you know, some of the haute galleries are going to, you know, the 57th and above are going to sell some 19th century American art. But nobody's doing this. Alfred Stieglitz was showing a little bit of European, a little bit of American, but it's really in 1926 when Edith brings this to the fore and sort of busts it wide open. Another of her favorite artists is Charles Schuyler, and so this is classic landscape of 1931. And a brochure for a show that he did that's actually on the cover is a painting, which, as you might know, he loved photography and painting, and his paintings are often based on photographs, so they have that very photographic look. You'll see it in the show. This is an amazing painting. But he is known for his precisionism. Again, very different than some of the other artists that are being represented, the sort of streamlined linearity, crispness, whether it's an urban scene or if he paints rural scenes, like, Barnes in Bucks County. It's always very precise, linear, and crisp. And here she is, Edith, photographed between two Sheilas, at least you get to see most of one. But next to it, I have put textile samples because the dress that she's wearing was actually, the fabric was designed by Schuyler. And this was something that, Edith was encouraging her artists to branch out, to do more design work, to create things like Schuyler created salt and pepper shakers, with those little poked holes for the S and the P. Guess who did that? Schuyler, and his idea got ripped off. But he showed it first in the downtown gallery. So she was very interested in combining kind of, I call it multimedia, but expanding the boundaries of thinking about what an artist can do, and especially for their livelihood. Now, Schuyler never made any money off his textiles, but it's a lovely dress. And so here's a Macy's window display, and in fact, one of the things that she did was to get, speaking of Macy's again, got her artists' designs and textiles and paintings on the wall in Macy's. So this kind of way of cross-promoting and finding ways to get those artists out there. This is from a little bit later, this particular exhibition poster. But what this shows us is, or reminds me to say, is that Edith had all kinds of ideas of marketing. The idea of democratizing and making things inexpensive. Again, putting the pretty stuff or attractive stuff up front. She was one of the first to allow people to buy on installment plan. You couldn't buy art on installment. Again, we take these things for granted. We think, oh, that's part of the system. No, guess what? This was Edith Halpert, who thought about her Macy's time and her banking years early on and brought that into play. So this is, this poster was an idea that she developed. Why not buy art for presents, for Christmas? And so it's like, instead of a bracelet or a car or money or a radio, give art. For $20, you can show that you're cultivated and that you care about somebody. And so she, wrapped that into her marketing plan. And I just point out that these are, maybe no-brainers now, but they weren't accepted, before that. And she was all about the strategy and the new idea. But I'm switching gears here, and I, mentioned that she created these installations and experiences and environments, if you will, in her space to allow people to kind of visualize things and to think differently, to recontextualize things like what we would call folk objects. Now, many of us antique, or, it's a great pastime. And it was happening at this time, but these things weren't considered super important. Nobody was paying a lot of money for them. So she got in on the sort of 1920s, drive your car around to different dealers or yard sales or estate sales, and that eye, that she could find good artists and understand the modern contemporary scene also was an eye she could put to these Americana objects. So weather vanes, the cigar store Indians or Native Americans. These are nine pins. Different aspects of culture that were American. And again, that was really important to her. This idea of things that Americans had made. And it could be a variety. It could be from different centuries. She called these, and sort of framed it this way in her gallery, she called these the American ancestors. Yeah, maybe yes, maybe no, but they are, made by American artists, some whom we know and some whom we don't. But they look really nice with things, and some of them have, really interesting histories, and they are artistic. So she framed them that way. She sold them for a good price, and people started collecting them even more and showing them. Abby Aldrich loved these things, but so did many other collectors. And so this sort of folk idea, folk objects, American culture sort of becomes elevated. And eventually there'll be museums devoted to this. But she's one of the first to devote a whole gallery to it, or to intersperse some of these objects in with her other paintings. These are just two installation views. You see a lot of chickens, I guess. But door knockers. I mean, whatever it was, she found a way of finding interesting ways to display them and to give them integrity as their own objects. And I should say the important thing about this as well, I mean, it's important on the one hand that she cultivates this taste for Americana and gets it into the public, but it also sustains her gallery. We're talking about the Depression era. And Edith Halpert is making money in 1929, the Depression happens, things are going sour. 1931 is like really hard for her. And she can't keep the gallery open. She can't sustain the artists that she wants to support because nobody's buying. Even Abby is sort of cut back. But she brings in this folk art, and people start buying that up. And that sustains the gallery. That is the income, so that she can support this program of avant-garde American artists. And, lo and behold, John D. Rockefeller Jr. is creating Colonial Williamsburg at this point. So Abby's got her mind on this idea that she's collecting things to show at Williamsburg, and eventually creates a sort of museum there of that. Abby's sense of history is a little skewed, but just to say, she cared more about the aesthetics than the specific history. Edith was a little more about the history, but regardless, we get Colonial Williamsburg, we get the Shelburne Museum, we get folk collections throughout the country. And Edith's reach was very large. If people weren't buying in New York, she was selling in Wichita. She was bringing also, at a certain point, artists from Chicago and Los Angeles into her gallery. She had such a good eye, right? And the things that she was coming upon and purchasing and then turning around or finding for different collectors were top-notch. And they included more than weather vanes. She basically rediscovered, I didn't bring his paintings in here, Edward Hicks. So if you know any of the Peaceable Kingdoms, that was her who put Edward Hicks on the map. I mean, he was long dead, but his work. And I love this Joseph Pickett work, this painting, because it's up at MoMA right now. So some of these things made it to MoMA, and now they're on display again, because that's part of MoMA's fabric and early history. So this idea of a kind of outsider art or popular vernacular art, Edith was one of the people who brought that to people's attentions. And then this beautiful quilt here. And again, a lot of the Pickett is at MoMA, but you'll see just from the names of where these are in collections throughout the country. And that was her mission, to get this stuff seen. Here is, they didn't know the attribution at the time, but it turns out to be by John Brewster. You'll love this in the show, this beautiful boy with Finch, but, and many, many more. So she sort of branches out into picking really beautiful 18th and mostly 19th century works. The William Michael Harnett there, Old Models of 1892, this was a big score. So Harnett wasn't super well known. And Edith was really interested in his, what she discovered in this painter, this amazing illusionism. And again, something that she saw sort of played out in some of her other contemporary artists. And Harnett suddenly set the sort of market on fire. And she was able to sell these. And she also had people combing and trying to find these things for her so that she could sell them. Harnett is amazing. She also dealt in Peto's work. And as she said, Harnett was the biggest sugar daddy I ever had. And of course, by that she means, this artist, he dies in this year, 1892. He certainly was no longer alive, but coming upon Hartnett's work, discovering it, and being able to sell it to, MFA Boston and different places kept her alive. And she felt that it was beautiful work, and that people should be aware of, again, the American ancestors and this whole sort of breadth of American art. There she is, and you might not be able to see her dog, but I hope that you can. It's in her lap. That's her dog, Adam. And Adam was not only her loyal pet, but sometimes he would bite people if they tried to negotiate too low. So, right on command. I'm also going to let this stand for more of the 1930s, representation by, different artists. There are a lot of portraits of her. This time is up and down financially, and she's, trying everything she can to keep her stipends for different artists going and to keep the different strategies and exhibitions. She's being incredibly innovative, but it's, but it's tough at times, even with Abby's help at points. She moves. Things happen. She actually gets married again. I should say Sam dies, and he and Edith had basically been separated anyway. As I said, she keeps his name, and she has lots of relationships. Eventually marries somebody out of the blue. He turns out to be a real scoundrel. He turns himself into jail. So that this happens like in 1939, a bigamist. Anyway, she didn't have the eye for men, perhaps, that she did for art. But it is to say, her fortunes are sort of moving around at this point. But after the marriage falls apart, her husband goes to jail. She wants to put all of that behind her, and doesn't really talk very much about it. She decides she is going to move uptown. She's had, enough time in the village. She wants to figure out a new situation and try to drum up sales. She moves to 51st Street. First, 1940, she's at 32 East 51st Street, and then 5 years later, she moves across the street to number 43. She stays there until 1965. So she's selling all throughout this time. It's a chance to sort of turn over a new leaf and have a new space, and again, use her metal netting walls and make it all look new and interesting, and she transforms the space. So shortly after the move, she undertakes a really important exhibition. I mean, all of her exhibitions are important, but she is friends with Alan Locke, and they talk a great deal about African-American culture and life. And Edith writes to Abby and Aldrich Rockefeller, says, "Can we start a gallery in Harlem of African-American art, for the people, by the people?" Abby's like, "I think it's a good idea, but I can't do this right now." So Edith puts on a show called American Negro Art. And if any of you are saying that term seems not appropriate, that Negro was used in this context, and it's a word that, as we'll see, Jacob Lawrence used in describing his own work. African-American artists were using that word. So, but she had the intention of sharing African-American artists with the public, making sales and getting this art seen. And while with the exhibition, a lot of people saw difference and contrast and said, these are African-American artists, this is different. It may be good, it may be interesting, but it's separate and apart. Edith felt that this was an underrepresented strand of American art that was part of the fabric that people had just ignored. So for her, this was it was a mandate. It was a mission that she needed to show more of the important contemporary art being made, but also the ancestors, if you will. So she showed works from the 19th through 20th century. She often borrowed works to put in her shows. So we have a 19th century Duncanson here and a beautiful Romare Bearden from 1941. And that Romare Bearden is on display at MoMA, so that after church. So go look for it. There's a beautiful room dedicated to Harlem right now on the 4th floor. She also had shows of Horace Pippin. She could never get him to settle down and be just at her Gallery. And here's a wonderful Augustus Savage, this gamin, or sculpture of a boy. And Augustus Savage, not only Jacob Lawrence's teacher, but a wonderful artist in her own right. Maybe some of you saw the New York Historical Society show recently of her work. But many, many more artists, so giving them exposure. And Jacob Lawrence is one of my favorite painters. I spoke here about the migration series. Originally, it was called the Migration of the Negro. Again, what Lawrence was trying to encapsulate, and we see the artist there, is in 60 panels, same size, some horizontal, some vertical, painted in tempera, an idea of the mass migrations of African Americans from the South to the North and the Midwest from World War I up through this time period. He was 23 years old. He was well known in Harlem, but he hadn't been represented. And again, Edith, in taking this on, was taking on something that other dealers and other museums hadn't before this. So representing African American artists in a very big way and promoting them for sales. These are just a few of the migration series, and here is an installation shot. And another picture by him. So she really bolstered his career, and we know him because she put him on the map. And you might know that the 60-panel series, of which we just see 4 there, Edith Halpert brokered the deal from her show. Duncan Phillips and Alfred H. Barr Jr., so Phillips from the Phillips collection. Phillips from the Phillips collection and Alfred H. Barr Jr., the director of MoMA, split the 60 panels. And it was a real coup for the artist to have representation in museums. So, this is typical of Edith Halpert. And she maintained a long-standing relationship with Lawrence after this. She starts being featured in Time magazine and Life magazine. I listed a lot of artists here. They're all in the photograph there, and probably don't know any of these today. And part of my point in saying that and sort of starting to wind down her career is that she continued to sell until the late 1960s, but we have a whole sort of explosion of abstract expressionism, which she wasn't very much a part of. We also have other dealers, women dealers, coming to the fore. We have Peggy Guggenheim, who opens the art of this century with European and American artists from 42 to 46, 47. We also have Betty Parsons. Then eventually we have Sidney Janis, a male dealer, and others who are sort of entering the field. During the 40s, people start buying more art, so that's a good thing. But also the field is changing, and Edith is not so interested in some of these newer artists. Actually, this Life spread had some of her older generation artists, so the ones that we would know, but I just showed you the ones we don't. She is, again, continuing to have sort of breakneck exhibitions. She's, again, involved in selling to museums and institutions around the country. She is also involved in setting up municipal exhibitions. So she is constantly busy and promoting her artists and brokering deals and bringing things together. This is something that happens in Russia. So as part of this kind of Cold War, the United States send over a whole bunch of delegates with things like exceptional industry and, I don't know, blenders or whatever we take, science and industry, and we have a whole art section. And Edith is tapped to not select the works, but curate them, put them on the walls, and give lectures in Russian to Russians about American art. We see some abstract expressionism there. She hated Pollock. That was like her bête noire, but a lot of her artists were represented in the show, and she could hang them how she wanted. She ended up getting into a tiff with President Eisenhower over this, but they loved her in Russia, and in fact, they didn't like Pollock, but they did like Andrew Wyeth. And as Edith said, it was interesting because a lot of the sort of American taste was the same as the Russian. So I just sort of throw that out there, but also to show you the kind of her reach at this point. And maybe she's not selling as much, but she's involved in all of these different things. This is one of her later shows, and I just find this fascinating. Again, this sort of folk art and how it's how it's installed and treated. This is exactly at the moment that pop is coming into being. So at the signs and symbols, and of course, Edith always has an agenda. So not only is she showcasing these works, but she's thinking about it as a way of also showing how those ancestors, with their sign painting and their vernacular, feed into her artists. And of course, at this point, Stewart Davis's career is picking up a little bit, but you can see this wonderful with the champion sign, or Lucky Strikes, or Odal, or Champion, or how that's sort of borne out. So she felt pretty vindicated in that, and especially that Stewart Davis had survived and was getting some acclaim. And there she is at some point in between a Charles DeMuth and that he painted, and a Stewart Davis there. As I said, she continues to sell things at the end of the 60s. I should say at the beginning of the 60s, she is starting to promise her collection, and it should have gone to the Corcoran. So her own art collection. She loans it on exhibit, and in fact, she sends her own collection around the country. So that sort of promotes American art, and at this point, people are sort of really, really taking an interest. And again, she wants it to be an education. She's not doing this. I mean, she wants people to know she's the one behind this, but she wants people to understand American art, to see where it comes from, and to see its lasting power, to sort of think about a legacy of ancestors and a sort of multiplicity of what American might mean. And it's catching on, and museums are starting to get interested. She had things in her will set up for the Corcoran, but towards the end, she was suffering from dementia, and the will was ripped up, and when she died, there was no will. And so it was quite problematic. She had a niece and nephew, and she dies in 1970. And after several years, in 1973, there's an auction, and the records were set for Stewart Davis and different artists. So in a certain way, that legacy was fulfilled. That she had made the market for these things that we have come to appreciate, whether you like this artist or that artist, that we respect. That they were very much a part of the 20th century and gave to that. So I think that's a wonderful sort of testament to her legacy, and a kind of difficulty for the Corcoran. Unfortunately, she'd given them a lot of work, but they didn't get the collection they thought they were going to get. And I thought I would just read this. This is William Zorak writing an autobiography, actually, in which he talks about Edith. And I know it's a bit long, but I think it really helps us to kind of put a bow on this. Edith Halpert was always full of ideas and projects. She didn't have to depend on anyone. She didn't follow in the footsteps of others. She didn't take the easy way of promoting and selling European art, where the path was clear and well-trodden. She set out to promote American art because she believed in it, and realized that if the country was ever to have an American art, it had to come out of American artists. This she made her goal, and she stuck to it with a single-minded devotion. American art owes her a great debt. And I think, with cigarette in hand, a little bit of drinking, some strategizing, he's pretty much encapsulated it. So I know I threw a lot at you. I'm happy to take questions, comments. I want to encourage you to go see the show, to read these books. Yes. We always talk about the sort of shift in the art market around World War II, and how abstract expressionism becomes so important. But I think Europe lagged in buying the American art. And I don't think it was Edith's purpose either to sell it to the Americans, so she didn't care who if she could promote her artists and get them known. I think some of the artists, I would say it's not with Edith, it's more the end of the 50s, 60s, with people, maybe even earlier, early 50s and 60s, with dealers like Leo Castelli, who sort of bridged that gap, and actually having been coming from Europe, having been a dealer in Europe and coming, living in America, but having shows in Europe, sort of introducing some of the American artists. And of course, there were a lot of American artists like Ellsworth Kelly and Rauschenberg and others who, on the GI Bill went to Europe. So this sort of post-war period was an interesting time. Of course, they were gathering, some ideas from Europe, but there was a much more open exchange, I think. And at that point, I think American art was being valued a little bit more than it had been, right?
Promote American art.
Yeah, it's a great question, and absolutely, here she comes from somewhere else. She was born in Russia. She's Russian, but I think some of the answer is she felt strongly committed to this country. She, moved here when she was a few years old and grew up here. And even though she had been taunted by, people in public school, like she had to make her own knickers for PE class, and, it wasn't easy having to learn English and to be scrappy. She felt incredibly devoted. She came from luxury and she came from Russia, and those are two separate things, but she put that behind her. She always sort of didn't speak of that part of her life, and it seemed as if she adopted this country and she adopted it wholeheartedly. She appreciated the freedom of what America stood for, and she didn't want to follow the rules of what she felt was imposed on women, and she wanted to take on artists with that same sense of democracy and freedom. She wanted to take on male artists and female artists. She had gay artists. She had Jews. She had Kuniyoshi from Japan, but that she felt that they embodied the multiplicity of America and the strength of America. So she felt very patriotic. And I mean, it seems very, I don't think it was just a scam or like, this is a corner of the market that I think needs to that I can pounce on. Sure, she liked a great deal, or she liked the find, but she was so excited to think about the discovery of new artists and artists from the past. And you're right, she could have done it any which way, but I think she felt she grew up here. Yes, absolutely. She's one of the pioneers. As I said, there were some other dealers, all men at this point, Charles Daniel, Alfred Stieglitz, and others. She does talk about the challenges, and she says people would do things to her or say things to her that they wouldn't say to men. Part of it is she talks about other dealers. She's like, other dealers went behind my back and did certain things to me, like they were jealous of what I did, or they tried to get me back, or they tried to take my artists and things like that. So she does talk about it, and it's often framed in terms of, they thought I'd be weak, or they thought I'd, do this and that. But also, her struggles are like, struggling with Stieglitz. Stieglitz wants to sell Georgia O'Keeffe's work for $4,000, and Edith doesn't want to sell O'Keeffe's work for that much money because she wants to get her more visible and promotion, and she doesn't want her to lose the Rockefeller's Radio City Music Hall gig, because $1,500 is the most they'll do. They don't care if she can get $4,000 for a painting. Like, Edith is thinking about things like that, and that's part of her struggle with people, is kind of her ideas about things. But yeah, she talks about it. People at times not understanding, or like preconceived notions, and also some sort of prejudice about, even her own husband, that, you should maybe, Sam thought that maybe she shouldn't be an artist. That was not about being a dealer. But so he ended up telling her later on that he and one of her art teachers dissuaded her. She didn't take to that kindly. They separated. But, this idea that she felt it sort of all along, but on the other hand, she made her own rules. She hung out at the speakeasies. Nobody's going to tell her she can't do this or that. If she wants to sleep in, she's going to do it. So she was a bit of a maverick in all ways, but definitely the pressure was there. When I mentioned that 8%, there were people who sort of scorned her and said, this isn't appropriate for a woman to be doing this. But those aren't the people she wanted to listen to. Yeah, I would agree completely. Yeah, and if you think, and so again, I encourage everybody to go. I think it's well hung. I think it's beautiful. I love the wall colors, but they dazzle. So this is meant to be a sort of amuse-bouche and have you sort of, get acquainted or reacquainted with some of these people, and then to, experience them in 3 dimensions, whether it's a painting and with a frame on the wall, or, there's wonderful archival materials, and I think it's a stunning show. So I'm so glad that you bring that up. And again, a testament to a really remarkable, feisty woman with gumption that had an idea of what she wanted to do, and pivoted and made it work for these artists. I think they really are beautiful works. Yeah. Let's see what I know about that. Okay, so the Smithsonian has her archives, and that's what I understand. And again, there's like, there were like 90 hours of recordings. I mean, she.
And the letters
Yeah.
between Abby and Edith, do they have all those?
I don't know because I haven't gone to see it, but I think, and I'd have to look back at Lindsay Pollock's book to because she mentions all of where these things are, or where most of them are, but they're well, no, I'm backtracking on this. Most of Abby's letters were not available. I'm rethinking this answer because it's something that Lindsay talks about, that she went to Kaiket and tried to kind of uncover a little bit more about Abby, like from sort of her standpoint, and they destroyed or made unavailable her stuff because I guess they didn't want sort of that aspect to be sort of overblown or so they actually, I mean, I don't want to say like threw them on a bonfire, but I do remember Lindsay saying that the Abbey part of it is not so attainable. I think they don't have them. I think they like removed them. I don't want to like start any rumors or anything like that, but that was my vague recollection, was that they kind of really wanted Abby to be represented in the way that, a certain light, shall we put it that way. Yeah, but Edith's stuff is at the Smithsonian. Yeah, I don't, as I recall, it didn't last until, sort of the end of Edith's career. I know there were some bumps along the way, and I know that, and this is more in the beginning, that after the Diego Rivera issue, I don't want to say Abby was put on restriction. I don't want to make the Rockefellers out to be bad and wrong, but it was not so easy. She couldn't just drop by the downtown gallery and spend money on modern art. There was a sort of period when, not only because of the Depression, and so she was having to sort of, even she, cut back or, explain her spending, but that it was a little bit politically dicey because Edith was so progressive in her program. I mean, she didn't cause the, Diego Rivera whitewashing, mural fiasco, but she had shown Orozco's work before, and she was, showed Ben Shahn's work, and she, so she was identified with a more sort of progressive platform. And Abby was, there's I think even in the catalog, so I've gone between both of these things, I don't know which it's from, but talks about Abby saying, I missed you. Like, I feel that I wish that I could come like downtown, and then they kind of repaired that a little bit, but there were things that Abby did that Edith didn't like. So when Ellie Neneman and his wife, they had a huge collection of folk art, and they lost their money in the Depression. And they put it all up for sale, and Edith was their broker, and she tried to sell it to Abby, and Abby had already handpicked so much folk art that she already wanted that she didn't want theirs. So, you know, yeah, they had some ups and downs. Sonnabend, yes, and so absolutely, thank you for bringing that up. So Leo Castelli and Ileana Sonnabend were married, and they had a gallery together, and then they split, and they had their own stable of artists. And that's exactly the moment in which, to answer that question again, or to drill down, the idea of these European dealers dealing in American art, like, you know, James Rosenquist and Andy Warhol and others. I don't want to say somebody who wasn't in their stable, but Rauschenberg, taking those works to Europe, showing them in Paris and things like that, sort of building up a European market for American art. Happens in the 50s and 60s. So that's exactly the moment of Ileana Sonnabend. And there was a wonderful show of her work, of her collection, of her dealing at MoMA a few years ago. Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, she, again, I don't want to say following on the heels of Edith Halpert, but again, it's sort of, the whole landscape had changed by that point. And part of it is, you know, war and then post-war and all of that, and European influx because of the war, artists and community, but also, you know, both Leo and Ileana in separate ways were incredibly profound dealers and had amazing eye and relationships with their cadre of artists. So, yeah. Anything else?
Well, thank you, Larissa.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. So, and I'm so glad that some of you have gone, and I can't wait to know that the rest of you have gone. So.
We'll
Thank you.
look forward to your next visit.
Oh,
Very much.
thank you. Thank you. And